Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today, involved in creating a better tomorrow on some really unique fronts. Today we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Tim Wittig, who is a conservationist, a professor, a former defense intelligence analyst, who has served as a research fellow at Oxford University in the Oxford Martin School, an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, as well as head of intelligence for both the Royal Foundation's United for Wildlife Transport and Financial Task Forces, as well as the Wildlife Investigations Charity Focus Conservation. Dr. Wittig has lived in 8 different countries on 3 continents, worked in about 50 different countries around the world, and his professional background is a really fascinating mix of R&D and applied scientists, with focus on intelligence-led targeting of these illicit financial networks, with heavy focus on Africa, but global security overall. Dr. Wittig began his career in national security. He was one of the first people in the United States intelligence community to focus on biodiversity and treat biodiversity and ecosystems collapse as a major threat to global security. Since 2016, Dr. Wittig has played a central role, as I mentioned, in United for Wildlife and both of their task forces, this really groundbreaking program of the Royal Foundation of the Prince and Princess of Wales to use data intelligence alongside high-level formal commitments to mobilize some of the biggest banks in the world, shipping companies and airlines, ultimately to make meaningful action against global wildlife trafficking. He also conceived of and currently runs the Central Intelligence Sharing System of both task forces, a former tenured professor of international relations and humanitarian action, and a lifelong environmentalist and outdoorsman. Dr. Wittig, like many people today, really believes that reversing this catastrophic extermination that's occurring in nature is probably the single most important issue of our time, and really touches all aspects of the planet and humanity. You can pick up a copy of his book, Understanding Terrorist Finance, available on all major booksellers. And Dr. Wittig has his undergraduate bachelor's in history from William and Mary, did his master's in international security studies and Ph.D. in interrelations, University of St. Andrews. We're lucky to have him with us today because we're going to be getting into a lot of interesting themes. But Dr. Tim Wittig, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much, Ira. It's great to be here, and I love your podcast. It's really interesting, so it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here, Tim, and thanks for those kind words. You've had such, and I will put the link to your website in the bio to the show, and I encourage everyone listening and watching to go take a look because I'm not going to do all this justice. But you've really had such an amazing portfolio to date, and I would just sort of love to start off at the beginning, a little bit about your story on not just how you got involved in defense, national security, intelligence, but also sort of this early theme of sort of asymmetric warfare, asymmetric operations. You're hanging out in the field in Chechnya, studying Al-Qaeda financing. You're in places like Djibouti and Ethiopia looking at Al-Shabaab. Take us through some of those early days and how all this started, if you would.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Well, yeah. So, like I said, I grew up in the DC area. So, I think growing up, I probably had my dad worked at the Pentagon for a bit. I remember he used to bring back these books, Soviet Military Power, which they published at the time, which were fascinating stuff. So I think I was always interested in, the international and national security element. My mom's actually was born during World War II in Europe. So we have a lot of family history relating to the Holocaust and what happened in Europe and in the during World War II. So I think I kind of grew up in that milieu and really was very, very interested in that personally. And then undergrad in history and then kind of had a bunch of random experiences, I think, that then so it wasn't like a planned path necessarily, but I think originally actually I worked my first job out of college was actually with a defense contractor. I was it's called SAIC, Science Applications International Corporation. It's big. I remember there was a article kind of after 9/11 that said the article started like, there is no shadow government, but if there was a shadow government, it would be SAIC. So there was a lot of like interesting projects going on at SAIC, and then I actually ended up working on some weapons of mass destruction thing. I was just kind of a recent graduate, but then actually ended up working at the Olympics, at the 2004 Olympics on the security system and with the police and also the fire brigade. And that was actually very interesting and very kind of formative too, because it was a huge contract, hundreds. I mean, I think the Greek government spent like over $1.2 billion on security for that. But then what it was there was a lot of, I guess, theatrical elements to that. And then there was as like American contractors, a lot of people that came in tried to do kind of a cookie cutter application of a lot of what we did post 9/11 for the 2004 Olympics, which just did not work. And then but then they things just got done, through kind of this local ways of doing things. And then I think that was really interesting, because I think that kind of piqued my interest in how kind of maybe the way the world works is not how we think it works, and so especially how these kind of big institutions and big kind of formal systems that they're maybe the now later I can theorize this a little bit better, probably, but they're kind of the framework, but they don't actually determine much necessarily. And so the real action is kind of at the ground level. And when you get outside of the Western sphere, so specifically outside of Europe and North America, things are done very differently. And so I've since then found that very fascinating, kind of the cultural and socially specific dimensions of how security works, and then also how the financing, how the money is part of that, which has kind of been a theme running through my career. So so those kind of those like early totally random experiences, I think, probably shaped something. And then I decided to do my PhD, and I've always kind of split my time between the practice and the academic side.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the finance for a bit, and again, I sort of looking through your bio, one of the things that popped out, and I correct me if I'm wrong, it looked like some time that you were spending, I think, in Mozambique back in 2013, where sort of this topic of wildlife trafficking converging with narcotics and other transnational threats sort of popped on the screen. And, I'm looking at some of these numbers in terms of, overall what we're dealing with today, somewhere between $150 billion. And we talk about timber and rhinoceros horns and ivory and pangolin and all the other wildlife stuff that's now imbued in this system. It's not just, here's some guns and here's a rhinoceros horn. It's a much bigger thing than that. Talk about some of your early experiences with this, because I think this plants the seed
Mhm.
for then, we'll get into the national intelligence assessments, all the cool stuff you did a couple of years later, but talk about what was happening at that point where your first aha moment that, oh, there's something much bigger happening here.
Yeah. So I think I have to say I never thought I would have ever worked in kind of wildlife area, and like early in your career, and but I grew up as a nature lover, would go out camping a lot, and I'm from Virginia originally, so go out the Blue Ridge and things. But then actually in grad school, when I was doing my master's, my roommate at the time, he was a biology Ph.D.
Mm.
and he ended up working in Congo Brazzaville, and in a national park called Lac Tele, which is this enormous national park. I think it's the size of Wales or something like that. And his kind of stories from working there, were about kind of tracking arms shipments through through the park, and all these political dynamics. And in some cases, NGOs are working as almost like a de facto government. And I thought it was totally fascinating, as like a political science and international security type person. And I had no idea that this was part of conservation at all. Then and then when I worked for DoD, and when I was doing some of the practical stuff, I found, talking to conservationists and people that worked in conservation, they often had like a very good understanding. I would call it like an 80% understanding of how things really worked in a country. Because I think if you work on the environmental issues, you understand. And this, this was mostly about Africa, but I think this holds true for everywhere. I think this holds true for Virginia also. If you actually look at the things like nature, environmental conservation, also public health, and some of these other things, I think you get a really true picture of how things actually work. Like, how does the government actually work? How, what are the corruption dynamics? Who actually calls the shots? Where are the power centers? So all of the things that, as like a political science person, or as an intelligence analyst, or as a decision maker, you need to know. And also where the funding, how the funding, where the political economy of it. Actually, these environmental people and the conservation people had such a great, solid 80% understanding of that. So I would often reach out to them and talk to them. Then kind of from that, when I was working at DoD, we did a lot of work on kind of. So I worked in a kind of a special unit at U.S. Africa Command that was about, we call it the Knowledge Development Unit. And what it was actually people that were social scientists, so people with PhDs that had some kind of Africa expertise, spoke African languages, had spent a lot of time, doing research in Africa, and as I had for my PhD and on some projects before that, mostly around East Africa and the Horn of Africa, or people that were actually born in Africa and then had emigrated to the U.S. And then were and we had clearances and all of that. But so we were part of the intelligence apparatus, but we were actually social scientists. We were actually researchers. So everything we did was transparent and open and things. And so we had a big project on kind of the Indian Ocean side of Africa. And Mozambique was one of these countries that from the U.S. perspective it's not on the U.S. radar, let's say, so it's not like a country that most American decision makers know too much about, spend much time on, or spend much money on either. So actually that's but there was some kind of rumblings of some things happening there. So we did a proposal to actually do some research down in Mozambique, in northern Mozambique, about kind of some of the dynamics there, using what the illegal wildlife trade as kind of a window into that. And it was a great project. I think it really highlighted all the kind of main issues, like big overlaps with a lot of social and economic inequalities that were there, There's a huge amount of real corruption. Like, for example, there was the economy of that area, northern Mozambique. A lot of it was ruby based, actually. So there were because there's alluvial ruby fields all over that area, northern Mozambique. So people literally, local people, they literally would make their income from just picking up rubies, very tiny, small ones, from the ground. So they wouldn't have to mine or anything. They would just find them, collect them, and then sell them. And so this was kind of the support of the whole economy. But then, as part of a development program, those mines were consolidated into, and it was run by a former minister, and who kind of, so basically you had this economy that was very equitable at first, for a long time, and then everything was kind of fenced off, and then it created all these social problems and all these economic problems. Then at the same time, huge oil, gas finds, and then that whole area has a whole history of, in those times of crisis, they kind of go towards their religion, and they there's often a jihad, right, declared, and so this has happened kind of in several cycles, including during the colonial times in Mozambique. And this is, and so we kind of assessed all this at the time, and we said, like, there's a bunch of indications here, and again, all looking at it through the wildlife lens, because we had great contacts there from the wildlife sector, but like I was saying, they understand a lot of the social dynamics, right. And both the expatriate ones, but then also most of the conservationists there are local people, and so so we talked to a lot of local researchers and people working in the reserve there, NASA Reserve, and actually we wrote this assessment that I thought was very good, and a lot of it's been proven right since then, because right. Now there's a huge kind of jihadist insurgency there, and it's become a real problem area. And so I think so that was one. That's kind of how we got into it originally, in from the DoD space. Mm-hmm. And I think that also answered a lot of questions. I think at the time people thought we were total freaks for working on that issue, and then but then we came back with all this good research and analysis, and I thought, actually maybe there's something to this perspective.
Yeah, no, so it's interesting because you come back, or I don't know if you're there or you're back here. So you're in 2013, you're writing, as you mentioned, this intelligence assessment on global wildlife poaching and tracking. 2014, you're involved in writing the White House national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking. In 2015, you helped to draft the END Act, eliminate, neutralize, disrupt wildlife trafficking. It's when we chatted a little while ago, I was talking, because I did that one episode with Brian Drake when he was at DIA, talking about sable spear and tracking all the fentanyl shipments and stuff coming out of China, and recently with Jeff Bacon out of National Intelligence University. It's just so interesting how we think about, okay, DIA and it's purely sort of looking at military stuff, but no, I mean there's all fentanyl traffic and wildlife traffic and climate change, and there's a lot of other. So talk a little bit about some of these assessments and sort of this 2013 to 2015 period where you're presenting all this, but at the same time, we can just say a few words about how our military, our defense system here does a lot more than just the aircraft carriers and the missiles and so forth. I mean, there's a lot more going on there. I think that's important. I want people to understand that.
Definitely. Okay. So it's interesting. Also, you mentioned sable spear, because some of the people we worked with right on wildlife actually were associated with sable later, part of that project. So and that's a very innovative project. It's great. Yeah. I think so first of all, kind of the timeline for the wildlife was within DoD was so we actually did this Mozambique project, I think, first. I mean, that was more on the the higher priority national security issues. But then kind of at the same time, that's when the poaching elephant poaching and rhino poaching crisis really became completely catastrophic in Africa. So around that time, it was really starting about 2008, but it really reached its it was starting to reach its nadir in 2012, 2013, in the next couple of years. So then there was actually a lot of attention among kind of political level people. So remember, there were I remember we'd have to answer letters a lot from Congress about what's the status of wildlife trafficking, and does Al-Shabaab really make all this money from ivory trafficking? And we would say no, they don't. That's not true. But then and Hillary Clinton was a big champion when she was Secretary of State, of this, and so she pushed it. And so obviously, when the Secretary of State pushes something, so that means that she calls up the Secretary of Defense, and that goes down from there. And then but I think, and then what was interesting when that national intelligence assessment was written, so this is a process that's very kind of well established, and it's a way for kind of the intelligence community to come to a common understanding of what everyone thinks on a particular topic, right? So they kind of gather everything, and there's an unclassified summary out there on this. And so, but that was interesting because it was, we would joke, it was like the land of misfit toys that all kind of came together. So it's all the environmental freaks from all the different agencies somehow found each other, to write this. And so you had this really great mix of people, all working on it, all really passionate about it, all very knowledgeable, and all adding a different angle, from their particular discipline. And so and then that ended up informing the national strategy, and then obviously then Congress responded with legislation. And so was kind of an expert on some of those discussions with the legislation. But with DoD, I mean, DIA is it's Defense Intelligence Agency. They focus on the military aspects, but there was a big at the time, and still now, there was actually a lot of emphasis on understanding kind of what might be called like non-traditional areas, so things that are non-traditional to the military, but actually, if you look at the history, they're always including this. So like social and cultural dynamics, historical dynamics. And then, we kind of added in the environmental dynamics and the financing too. So I worked, that's also another kind of way I came into this, was through threat finance. I worked with a lot of the threat finance people because of my previous background relating to terrorist financing. So it just kind of was this confluence of kind of lateral thinkers, I think, of which there are many, in the military. I really enjoyed my time there. I think it was really interesting. I think people in the military, I would say they generally, if they don't know something, they'll say, I don't know. And, they'll want to find out, so other institutions maybe don't do that. Maybe they pretend they know. So, but I found like actually a real open-mindedness in the defense area.
Yeah, that's why, as I said, that's why I enjoy having some of those folks on the show and hearing about sort of, I don't know, dual use or whatever you want to call it. But there's so much, cross fertilization here to benefit, all of us. So I know I appreciate sort of you talking a little bit of that.
And I have to say, I especially liked working with Marines. I think they were really intellectually curious, and I think maybe it's something part of their organizational culture. Although everyone else as well, but
yeah. So Tim, one of the, as I mentioned in the bio, one of the things you're really well known for is this amazing information sharing system that you helped to build at United for Wildlife, both the transport and the financial component of this, and obviously when you're shipping $150 billion worth of this stuff around the world. If you can interrupt the shipping, and if you can interrupt the finance, then you make a major dent in this. And I was wondering if you could just talk. I mean, I know you worked with the major shippers like the DHLs and the Emirates Airlines, and you had to, in partnership with Microsoft, you worked at Heathrow Airport to look for these dubious movements. Take us. I mean, there's so many pieces to this story, and you probably tell it better than me. Talk a little bit about sort of how you helped put all this together. It's really a really cool story.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So I think to kind of segue. So I worked for DoD, and then I actually wanted to work full time in wildlife, in the wildlife arena. And so I ended up working for Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, for a couple of years, big NGO. And then from that, I was introduced to the Royal Foundation. So the Royal Foundation, this is Prince William's Foundation. Right. Sure. And so they, do they have a big conservation program. And so at the time they were starting this new program called United for Wildlife, and specifically the Transport Task Force. Right. So the idea was that all illegal wildlife moves commercially. Right. Mm-hmm. So there's no, there's no rhino horn submarines like narco submarines, so they're just putting stuff on ships or on airplanes and moving it commercially, right? Either in luggage or on a person or in cargo, right? Or in a container. And so that's a huge bottleneck, obviously. So it's all moving, through private commercial means. So the Royal Foundation had this idea of how do we engage with the private sector, and specifically the transport companies, to kind of cut that link. And so so I think it started with 12 or 14 companies initially, and so we had a number of meetings, and I mean they had a number of meetings. It was chaired by William Hague, former foreign minister of the UK, and Prince William, and also actually at the time all the CEOs of these companies. So it was these kind of amazingly powerful meetings, right, to talk about wildlife trade. And so one of the commitments that they agreed to was the companies will act on intelligence that's given to them. Okay, but then the Royal Foundation reached out and they said, okay, we have this draft commitment, but we need help on really understanding what that means in practice, right? So and I think at the time I was definitely one of the only people in the whole conservation world that had an Intel background, and had worked on especially on kind of things directly relevant to wildlife trafficking, like threat finance, illicit networks in Africa and things. And so I did kind of a small consulting project with the Royal Foundation to design the system and then present it to the whole group, which was Prince William Hague, and all these CEOs, and then and presented it as here's a system for where we can send information in about wildlife trafficking dynamics and who's doing it and how they're doing it and where they're doing it, and what to look for to the transport companies. Because what's special about the wildlife arena is that almost all of this is known and it's open. It's because the NGOs and the conservation groups and local communities, they know what's happening. They know who's doing it. They know how it's being done. It's really operating out in the open. So it was really just a matter of creating that almost like logistical infrastructure to connect the people who had the information with the people who need it, and then package it in a way so that it could be understood, and also help this kind of supply side of the information, so that they were collecting what was needed, right? Because sometimes they're often biologists or activists, so what they think is important maybe is not what is actionable, and so I played this kind of middleman role, facilitator role, fixer role type thing to kind of help improve the quality of the supply, and then help on the demand side, because often the companies didn't even know what to do with this information, because they didn't even have systems to put it in, so there's a lot of kind of consulting, with them. I mean, it was essentially consulting where, looking at helping them assess kind of what their systems were, how this information could be, included, how it should be formatted, all this stuff. So, as I give a lot of training on like Intel, kind of Intel 101, often for like for small groups and for small NGOs and things. And that's what I always start with. I said, you're the Hollywood version of intelligence work of like, is a lot cooler than the actual work, but maybe less impactful than the actual work, because the actual work is actually, it's really about information, and it's about stakeholder management and building communities and networks and reading a lot and, building relationship networks. And so that's what, so that was essentially the system. And I think that's why it worked, is because it was built around a working level network of individuals within all these companies, kind of given the operating space by all these high level people working in the stratosphere, like Prince William and the CEOs and things. So they come with the voluntary agreements, okay, but then the working level, people are able to figure out all the details and then share information, because well-timed and well-packaged information is very powerful, right? You can really move decisions. And then so another thing from the company side is that often, these people were kind of like how we were in the IC, they were sticking their necks out internally, like from a bureaucratic standpoint, they were, because they didn't, a lot of these companies, well, none of these companies at the time had any policies on illegal wildlife trade. And, a lot of them said, well, can we even legally work on this? Can we do anything? Are we, so we would help them a lot on kind of winning those internal battles, right? Which I think is really interesting too, because I think that probably tells us a lot about how we can make corporations more sustainable, in general, because it's not all done through these formal processes. It's actually, that just kind of creates the operating space, but the real action is with the individual people within these companies, and helping them kind of change things, from that side.
Yeah, speaking, I mean, that's a perfect segue into sort of what you're going to be doing now and some of your new initiatives, Tim, because as I mentioned, before we started the call, well, a couple of days ago, I was watching your presentation. You gave this, and I recommend again everyone check this one out. It's from a couple of months ago at Oxford. You gave a talk entitled "Towards a Single Common Information Architecture for Sustainable Investing," where you go into the issues surrounding ESG, and you touch on issues like this is not about personalities or people. It's about, as you were just saying, systems and getting this right, as opposed to you touch on greenwashing and other sort of inappropriate strategies, let's put it that way. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about sort of the ESG landscape as you're looking at it nowadays with this expertise, and then you're started this new initiative known as Common Task AI, where you're going to be bringing in a lot of these new sort of cutting edge tools to deal with issues like data garbage and processing the right data and so forth to make the right decisions. Take us into a little bit of this and what you're headed for now with the new initiative.
Okay, great, thanks. So with the United for Wildlife system, the information sharing system, the big gap that we had, and we still have, is the scaling component, and like making a real system, because a lot of it had to do with so the strength of having this network of individuals and stuff is also in a way a weakness, because if the people leave, or things change, or whatever, then you've lost, that valuable node there. So the kind of the next challenge is like, how do you really institutionalize this and systematize it so you can do this, at scale? And so a couple of years ago, I started working with some of the people at Oxford on kind of how to bring together this issue of of data, and informing really analyzing and understanding the impacts that business activity has on nature and on biodiversity specifically. And so with my component, the kind of the lessons learned from what we did with United for Wildlife, and also the looking at things from an intelligence perspective, in the sense of it's the intelligence process, the intelligence cycle is very similar to like the data science process or the research or scientific process too. It's just, there's slightly different methodologies and especially how you kind of package it and things. So it ended up being relevant to the business world. And this team at Oxford, especially, and Oxford as a whole, they're really at the forefront of doing this research. So they have some of the best people in the world on doing this, kind of really understanding and quantifying and specifying what exactly the impacts of a specific type of economic activity are on a specific ecosystem or species and things. So really the strong science of it. And so they're a great team to work with. So there was a program called Benchmark for Nature that I worked on, and then from there ended up kind of expanding that to look at more of the data, how to analyze kind of the data problems with sustainability as a whole, right? So I think everything is sustainability now, so which is a great thing. And obviously that's, I've dedicated a lot of my career, to this, and I think it's a great moment. Okay, but to be objective, right? A lot of and scientific about it, a lot of the basis for decision making on sustainability is not very well quantified. Okay, it's not very well based on kind of very nuanced and specific evidence, right? And so this is, I would say, it's a medium-sized problem now, okay, but it will become a very large problem later, because as more of the as they say, trillions of dollars are going to be labeled sustainable and ESG, and big major government decisions, or all government decisions are going to be based on are going to include how this impacts the environment, how this impacts climate, how it impacts nature and species and ecosystems and public health and good governance and social equalities and things. But in order to really do that correctly, you need the evidence, so that you can make these determinations. And I think this is something coming from the intelligence background. The actual the bar is very high in the intelligence community about kind of, especially when you're making decisions, and the bigger the decision and the more consequential the decision, the higher the bar, right, in general, right? Now, whether the actual political leaders listen to that evidence and actually read the papers, that's a different question. Okay, so okay, but as far as like within the analyst community, the level of quality, I think, is very high, even the highest I've experienced. So there's a real demand for rigor and for evidence and for quantification. And so for sustainability, we really have to do this, because these are very complex issues. Climate is a relatively simple issue, because it's about emissions and about carbon. And so the cause and effect pathways there are actually relatively simple, right? And kind of what we're trying to do, we're trying to reduce, the amount of CO2 and some specific substances in the atmosphere, right? So that's relatively easy, or straightforward and simple from a analytic perspective. But then you talk about biodiversity, right? Then it's infinitely more complex. And then you layer in other issues too, and how they interact with each other. It's like, that's even more infinitely complex. Like a great example, and then you have trade-offs, right? And so like a great example is the push for electric cars and electric vehicles will require a huge amount of more mining for metals and minerals, right? And I mean multiples of what is already done. So mining is a very problematic industry, when it comes, activity when it comes to biodiversity and also society, right? So we're so the push for electric cars, is going to require this exponentially larger mining industry and activity. So is that a net positive or not? That we need the actual data to understand that, right? And so, but this data really doesn't exist to a level that is usable to really answer those questions with any kind of specificity, right? And so, I mean, you can make kind of general estimations globally or nationally, okay, but when you're talking about this activity will destroy this species and this ecosystem, and that's going to have these impacts. But then in order to do that, we're going to have these advantages over here. Okay. So, I mean, that requires a much bigger set of data and much more sophisticated analytic models, than we are operating right now. Going back to the Greek Olympics, experience. Okay. So one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was working there was that, so I worked in the fire brigade. And so at the fire brigade at the time, in 2004, when there was a fire in Greece, in Athens, there was someone on the phone or radio. They would find out where, the caller would tell them where the fire was. They would write it down on a piece of paper and walk it over to the person, to the dispatch, right? And they would dispatch it. Okay. So Greece has a lot of stone buildings and cement buildings and things like that. So there aren't actually that many fires at the time, although there were a lot of forest fires. But that's, so they had this very, you could say, old school and analog way of doing things. And then, the American contractors came in and installed all this cool, tech stuff and data and GPS and video walls and everything like that. But then they would still just use the paper and pencil method, even with all the stuff. So I feel like this is actually kind of maybe similar, where we have very good, we have a good system now about understanding how biodiversity works and climate and things, but it's not fully digitized, and it's not fully modern. And our data and our information system too is pretty antiquated, right? And so if you look at it, so I think all of these problems, really need a lot more research and a lot more objective analysis, right? Because if we don't do that, and again, I speak as 100% committed environmentalist. If we're not objective and serious about these data problems, it's going to cause a huge backlash. People are going to doubt a lot of the science. People are going to even more, so it's going to metastasize even more this problem of denial and distraction, climate and nature loss and things. And also people won't have it'll open up all sorts of opportunities for fraud. And in other words, greenwashing, and also just ineffectiveness, well-meaning ineffectiveness, which is also not good. That doesn't get us anywhere. So all sorts of bad things will come from this. And I don't think, so I think, and I haven't, there's only kind of a handful of people kind of working on that aspect. And then, so I find it very interesting. It's very easy to game sustainability ratings and data and analysis. There's been several, I think, pretty damning analysis of carbon offsets, for example. Maybe the whole methodology is off. Up to 94% of carbon offsets have no basis in evidence. So these are significant problems, and we can't just say, oh, but we mean well.
Right.
Everything's going to work out. So, right.
Well, it seems like it's definitely, as for the new group and sort of bringing some of these tools in, like the artificial intelligence and some of the other things you're going to be using, it's going to be a pretty fertile area for you apply your intelligence skills to say what's real and what's not. And so no,
so I think a big part of the answer is I would say the fundamental part of the answer is that this data that's available it's resident in local people. Okay. So like someone in a village in Mozambique, right, will have very good data just from a data perspective. They'll have extremely good data about what's happening in that village, right? From a health perspective, they'll from a disease perspective, from what's happening with animals, what's happening with wildlife species, the ecosystem, how things are changing, the pollution. So they are the experts in that village, right? And they have the best placement and access to collect information and data on what's happening relating to climate and biodiversity and health and sustainability issues, for their village. The same goes with someone in, West Virginia or in New Mexico or, whatever state in the US, where, so this kind of local data, but the problem is there's no infrastructure for people to kind of contribute that data in any meaningful way. So there's citizen science, which is a great movement, does this a bit, but and then there's lots of data platforms where you could say, oh, you can upload your data about this. And okay, but the problem with all of those platforms and the problem with citizen science is no one's paying you to do that. Right. So you're doing work for free that benefits, kind of the global. So you have this, tragedy of the commons issue. So what colleague Jim Golden, he's has a Wall Street background, but now is at the Rockefeller Foundation, chief data officer there. So what we've Jim and I have come up with this concept of a marketplace for this data that would kind of be an equitable marketplace where essentially you could get where probably through organizations like nonprofits and local governments that they're collecting all this data anyway, or they're in a position to collect all this data, that if you could tie that data as a commodity directly to the people with trillions of dollars to spend, that need this data and want this data, then that could be not only help solve the quantification problem of sustainability, but actually create a whole new realm of jobs that had to do, and income streams that had to do with documenting what's actually happening to our planet. And it would also make data the commodity instead of nature as the commodity, right? Because I think there's a problem with looking at nature too much as a commodity, because for every one person that will see the value of it and want to protect it, there's probably 10 people that are going to buy it cheap and develop it and sell it. It's I think it's an interesting, and it is kind of a natural evolution to what I was working on with the illegal wildlife trade. Actually, with in parallel to United for Wildlife, worked on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife and USAID funded project called Global Sync with Focus Conservation, and that was kind of a bigger application of what we had kind of built with the United for Wildlife aspect, and gotten a bit into some of this technical stuff through so I think this is I think it's an exciting time to be working in this field. Yeah, bottom line.
Tim, what going back just a couple of years, I just wanted to ask you real quickly because you had this paper in 2015. It was entitled "A Social Model of Conservation to Fight Wildlife Trafficking: What Conservationists Can Learn from Public Health," where you talk about sort of the social determinants of wildlife trafficking in comparison to social determinants of health. Um, Here we are in 2023, and we're just coming through a pretty nasty pandemic that, you know, whether it's the bats or the pangolins or whatever, you mess with nature and sometimes really nasty things happen to us. Any words about sort of what public health can learn from conservation?
Yeah, well, so that's thanks for looking at that old paper actually. I think so that actually came out of a lot of conversations with my very brilliant and wise wife, who works in public health, and so she really educated me on kind of on health and public health, especially non-medical intervention. So the paper basically talks about how there's two models of
Right.
health. There's a social model and there's a medical model, and then kind of with conservation we have like a biological model, and we need more of a social model,
Right.
also. And so so I think, first of all, I think the distinction between climate and health and biodiversity is actually becoming much harder to distinguish.
Right.
So I think because COVID is a perfect example of this. Pandemics are perfect examples of this. But in general, so there's huge mutual impacts, between climate, biodiversity, and health. And so I think, and health, I think, is a really interesting field because it's actually, I think, further along than conservation or climate or environmental things in general. As it's a science, health and public health. It's a very science-based enterprise, right? Because it's based on medicine and disease and understanding kind of what's impacting people. Okay, but it's also very socially attuned and politically attuned, and and that's the public health element to it, right? And I think that's what we're missing. So we're kind of in the environmental sphere, we're missing the equivalent of public health, right? We have medicine, but we don't have public health, right? Maybe it's a simple way to put it. And so yeah, so I think there's tons of there's lots to learn, from that. And yeah, and I think on the health side, I think there's maybe some things to learn from the environmental side too. Although I think I would maybe ask a public health practitioner what those would be.
Yeah. No, this is no, really fascinating stuff, Tim. I just it's again an amazing portfolio, and just with the new initiatives and a lot of what you're continuing to do. I just really wishing you the best with all this. Just while I have you, just a quick maybe minute or so. How are people in your sphere of intelligence and conservation reacting to the recent release of Victor Boot back on into the free world? A major, aside from arms trafficker, but a major mover of a lot of this wildlife bounty. A couple words there, if you would.
Yeah. So Victor Boot, he's he was the most important arms trafficker in the world when he was arrested, but also was, I would say, a real innovator in the illicit sphere, right? Because what he would do was, his shell company structures were so complex and hard to track that actually the UN and even the US government were contracting with him without them knowing, unknowingly. And so so he was, and he really innovated or invented even a lot of these transnational illicit network methods that are pretty standard now. so kind of putting him back on the battlefield, I think yeah, I would say it was a mistake. And but I think the impacts are going to be felt mostly in Africa, I would say. And that's also a big reason why I saw it as a real problem, because I think the biggest victims of this actually will be African, because Russia is almost. I even saw a newspaper article saying, and I agree with this, they've almost opened a second front for the war in Ukraine in Africa, especially in like Central African Republic and some of these countries where the Wagner Group is, where they're controlling huge concessions of forest. They're using it to log. They're exporting a lot of this. They're involved in a lot of illegal mineral trafficking, a lot of human rights abuses, extensive human rights abuses, a lot of encouraging government corruption and things like that. And so I think I can't imagine a scenario where Putin would not use Victor Bout, to expand and exacerbate all that, for Russia's interest. And so I think it was a big own goal, but on the other hand, hopefully we can rely on Russian incompetence to, for that, like what they're doing in Ukraine. So I think that's, but yeah, no, but seriously, I think, it's definitely something to watch. And so or it could be, or the other possibility is that he's old news and things, the world's moved on, so
we'll see.
So we'll see. Yeah, exactly.
So again, for everybody that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show, across the podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, again, you've been spending time with Dr. Tim Wittig, a conservationist, professor, intelligence analyst extraordinaire, really working on these crucial issues to help reverse this catastrophic loss and extermination of nature that ultimately affects the planet and all of us. Tim, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us and educate us about what you've been up to and things you've been doing. Obviously, thank you for doing them. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us via the work you're up to. It's a really great story, and I hope to have you on another episode in the near future to further highlight what you're up to.
Great. Thank you very much, Ira. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for all the work you do with this podcast. Yeah. Thanks.